Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Craig and Dave Unscripted. Thank you for joining us again. Just us this week, I'm afraid. No inspiring 14-year-olds have made it through to the final of a national competition. One thing we always said we're going to do in this series is address and talk about some of the common problems that come up on Facebook exam board forums. And one of the most common things we see is people posting excerpts of sort of students' mark papers, exam papers, and saying, they've written this answer to a question, or they've written this piece of code. Would you give it any marks? And often this more than any other question, Dave, these spark debate. Oh, I wouldn't give any marks for that. I'd give 4 marks for that. Now, hands up. We are not examiners working for any exam board. We're just experienced teachers that have been, working for years and marking papers. So these are our thoughts and our perceptions, okay? But what we're going to do today is actually look at, if I bring it up now, we're going to look at a typical question which is posted in an exam that's worth 8 marks. We're going to look at a typical student's answer, and then we're going to discuss, would we give that 4 marks? What's wrong with it? What's right? And we're going to start to unpick some of those sort of common questions which teachers are often asking. I'm just going to hide the banners so we can see this properly. And right, Dave, you want to sort of introduce us then to our question and our student's answer, and we can discuss what we think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this is a question that I've kind of made up, but it's based on a real question that has been posted on the groups before. So a program allows a teacher to record whether a student is present or absent from a lesson. After displaying their name, the program prompts the user to enter present or absent. After 20 students have been registered, the program outputs the number of students present and the number of students absent for the lesson. The names of the students are stored in an array called student name. The registration mark is stored in an array called student reg. Write a program the teacher could use for 8 marks. And here we've got a typical answer for a student. So before we look at the actual answer, perhaps we'll just have a quick glance at the mark scheme and have a quick discussion about that more generally, and then we'll reflect back on the answer and talk about it in a lot more detail. So if I scroll down here, we've got the mark scheme at the bottom. So let's just have a quick look at it. So 8 marks, and we've got 8 indicated points here in the mark scheme where we can award the marks. So what we're looking for is setting the initial values for present and absent, iterating over the 20 students, outputting the student name, inputting whether they were present or absent, storing that registration mark, correct condition based on the input to increase the present or absent count, to count the number of present and absent students, and then to output the number of present and absent students. So that's how we're going to go about awarding the marks here. Now, Craig, although you said we're not examiners, which is absolutely true, and it's important for us as Craig and Dave that we're not examiners actually, so that we can offer students and teachers advice. You have been part of the examination process though, haven't you? So I wonder whether there's anything that you can talk to us about here. And I haven't prepped you for this at all, so I do apologize, but is there anything that you can talk about in terms of mark schemes, how they are created, how they're applied, and any general tips here for teachers that are looking at published mark schemes from exam boards?
I was examiner many years ago, I should point out. So I've sat in those meetings where you are trained and when you look at typical answers. And ironically, I can probably talk more about it now than I could when I was an examiner, because you're not meant to, but I'll be careful what I say. But one thing that really can't even think of the word now. Well, one thing that really, surprised me when I sat in those first training meetings was the chief examiner. I won't even mention the exam board, but the chief examiner sat there and said, look, we're here to award students for getting it right. We want to show that. We want to pull out the best of their knowledge. We are not here to start with a maximum mark and look for every opportunity to take a mark off them. And that sentence was really quite revealing. You have to mark to the mark scheme. That sounds so obvious, but throughout the training and my experience, it made sense. And this is where I think a little bit of maybe frustration, and it's understandable. There's just a little bit of confusion comes when people post answers on Facebook forums, then people provide advice. Sometimes the advice, it's not wrong, it's just too harsh. You are there as a marker to award students for getting it right. We want to see the knowledge they have, and have they expressed their understanding in a way which gives you confidence as a marker that they get it. And if they have, they should be awarded the credit. Now, we're going to unpick what we kind of mean by that in a minute. But in general, what we're saying here is we're not penalising them. And the examples are quite clear. They say this in all their specifications. Do not penalise them for minor syntactical errors. There will be questions, as we all know, which say, write this answer in a specific programming language of your choice. But even then, you won't be penalised for forgetting the odd semicolon, for example, if we're programming in C#. It's and if you send papers off for remarking and moderation, it always comes down to, does the candidate show unequivocally an understanding of this concept? And if they do, it doesn't have to be exact. We are awarding students for getting it right. So, that start from the point of view of being a positive marker and not a negative marker. And as teachers, and I've been guilty of this, we often say, no, that's not right, lose a mark. And mentally, even if we don't consciously realize it, we're starting from the point of saying, well, I've got a maximum number of marks and I'm knocking off marks for getting things wrong. And that's not what we should be doing. It's like, can we get away legitimately with giving them a mark for this? Try and give them as much marks as we can. And if the mark scheme has a point and you can clearly see that understanding, then we should award that point. So, and that surprised me initially, but now it makes perfect sense. So I think that's probably what you were pulling out of me there, Dave, because we've talked about that before.
The code, let's get this straight. The code does not have to be 100% syntactically correct. If I was to copy and paste this program into it's kind of Python. It looks a lot like Python. If I was to copy and paste that into an IDE and run it, it's not going to run. It's going to come across syntax errors. But just because it doesn't run doesn't mean that you couldn't award the marks. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%, absolutely. And it may be different to the way that you teach them to program. It may be different to your own standards that you'd prefer they adopt, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, typically, as you guys who are teachers will know, this sort of question in the exam, when you look at the mark scheme, it will have the mark points, which we've got down the bottom, but it will also typically say, here's an example of some code which matches this mark scheme, except other valid alternatives. And we'll discuss that in a minute. We've used a while loop here, they've used a for loop. Just because the for loop is the one in the mark scheme doesn't mean we shouldn't award them the mark if they've used a while loop. So again, just because you see a certain coded example in a mark scheme doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that the student's code must match that exactly, or that you can't award marks. So yes, it's about applying the mark scheme sensibly.
Yeah, so before we forget, let's also just tackle, if you are an OCR student, and particularly if you're an OCR student on the GCSE, let's tackle this issue of the OCR reference language, because this has caused no end of angst amongst the community. But let me try and summarize, and then Craig, maybe you'll have something to input too. So it's very important when the exam board are writing exam questions that they examine what it is they're trying to examine. And actually, it's quite difficult to write exam questions that are very clear, they're unambiguous, and they are examining what it is they're supposed to be examining. And there's a huge process that these questions have to go through before they actually reach an exam paper. So in order to ensure absolute consistency in a world where there is no consistency, in other words, presenting algorithms with pseudocode, the exam board have to adopt a standard. Now, there is no real standard, so they sort of invent a standard. And it's a way of them displaying questions that include code in a very consistent way. They will always use iterations in a particular syntactical approach. They will always assign and compare variables in a particular syntactical approach. And it's about the exam board giving consistency to their questions and some familiarity for the students when they're revising and they're looking at the questions, that they know what to expect. And so that's what that's really about. Now, when it comes to a student answering the questions, the question is always, do they have to know, remember, memorize this pseudo fake, exam reference language that OCR have invented? And the answer is no. If you read the specification carefully, what it actually says is that although the questions will be presented in the reference language for consistency, a candidate can answer in the exam reference language if they choose. In other words, if you're going to do some pseudocode, you can follow our standard for it, but that means you need to teach it. Or, and this is the preferred route and the way that you probably should approach this, or you do it in a high-level language that you've been taught, i.e. typically Python at GCSE, but it could be others. And bearing in mind what Craig said a moment ago about it doesn't have to be syntactically accurate, as long as, let's say you were going to write it in Python, as long as it looks like Python and it feels like Python and it's got all the sort of attributes you'd expect from Python, it doesn't matter if it wouldn't run. If it looks like Python, it's Python, and that's kind of good enough for the exam board. And, have I got that right, Craig?
Well, I think you have. I mean, I'm sure the subject advisors won't mind me saying this, but maybe we can get one of them on in a future episode. We'll see what we can manage. But, the exam boards are not mind readers. And by that, what I mean is they do not know what language you are teaching. They might have a good guess it's Python, but you can teach what you like, as you know. And therefore, they absolutely have to have some form of consistency when presenting code type questions to you in an exam. And in previous years, it just means that every exam board have come up with a set of pseudocode and all their questions are presented that way. All OCR chose to do one year is turn around and formalize it a bit more. It's like, we're formalizing our pseudocode now. So we're going to call it, because it's formalized and because it's consistent, we're going to call it the OCR reference language. My God, the forums lit up. but bless them. I watched the subject advisors going, no, we're trying to make things easier, not more complicated for you. So don't fret over that. And as I said, as Dave's already said, they clearly say students can answer when you need to give a formal answer, not pseudocode. When you need to give the answer in formally, you can use our reference language, but feel free to use any high-level language of your choice. So, OCR will say it's not pseudocode because it's a formalized standard. And the forums will say, well, of course it's pseudocode because it's not real. And of course it is. But just get over that confusion. They're just trying to make sure there's no inconsistency. Every time you look at their exam papers, every time you look at a mock or a past papers, the code is presented in the same way for consistency and to be fair. That's all it is. But yes, it doesn't matter how your students write the answers. Get them to use the language that they are most comfortable with. If they've got it right, if you can see they've got it right, if it's ambiguous, if it's in the mark scheme, we should be awarding them marks.
Yeah,
right.
That's it.
Good.
If it's unambiguous, yeah.
Right. Let's
right. Let's have a look at the algorithm that the student's written, because at this point we've probably forgotten what the question is. But it's basically a student registration system. Okay. So here's the answer that the student's given just here. Okay, and we're going to break it down sort of almost line by line and comparing it to the mark scheme and working out whether we should award marks or not. But just looking at this holistically for a minute, okay, I'm spotting a few inefficiencies. I'm spotting a few situations where you could do things a little bit differently. Let's just have a little quick chat about that. So in terms of how you could do things a little bit differently, we'll talk about the while loop on its own in a minute, okay? But we've got things like, a print statement down here that is using the sort of the comma there to sort of concatenate the string present with the variable present. And we could have used, dot format instead if we'd been taught that way. We are not using any particular coding standard in here. This isn't Pascal case or camel case or snake case or anything like that going on. So there's no coding standard here either. In terms of my approach to the code here, without talking about particular statement lines, Craig, does that matter? I mean, is this, to what extent is the efficiency of my algorithm and my maintainability of my code, going to matter?
Well, it all comes down to what's in the mark scheme. It all comes down to what's in the mark scheme. I mean, there will be specific questions which will turn around and say, make sure you use appropriate coder comments. And there may then be a mark in the mark scheme for it. And if we left coder comments out, then obviously we'd lose a mark. Now, obviously, we teach students to use comments and write maintainable code with sensible variable names. We teach that. And that's going to come up in exam papers. But if there's a question which doesn't explicitly mention it, we don't want the student in the precious 90 minutes they're spending in their exam or an hour commenting every single line of code. As long as it is sensible enough, do the variables have sensible names? Is it clear to the marker what that line of code should be doing? Now, if all those names were, single letters, S and S2 and I and P, and then I'm there as a marker going, I'm not really sure what that's doing, we might be having a different conversation. Do we like the fact they've got a variable called student and one called students? Would be better, is that now a bit ambiguous what's going on? Could there be better descriptive names there? Possibly. But it's coming back to that mark scheme. I wouldn't be telling students to comment every single line when they're writing out code in the exam, because they're going to be wasting time. I'm going to tell them to use sensible variable names, make sure the code is laid out well. If you're using a while loop, or if you're using a selection statement, make sure your code then is indented, so you write it a little bit further in from the edge of the exam paper. Make it obvious what you're doing. As long as it makes sense and I understand your logic, then I won't penalise you for minor syntactical errors, because the exam will tell us not to. If it's in the mark scheme, I can see you've done it, I can see the intent, you'll get the mark. So it's more sloppy than if obviously I was getting them to write a program in the classroom, but then in the classroom we want it to compile, and that's when we sit down and pore over, well, what's causing that bug, what's the problem there. It'd be better off if you made those variable names a bit more explicit, because you've got confused later down in code and used the wrong one, you've forgotten an S, things like that. But for the exam, does it matter? Should we penalize them? No, we shouldn't.
Yeah, good. Okay, right. Let's take each line of this mark scheme then and see if we can mark this student answer and see where we get to. Okay, so let's have a look at the first mark then. So setting the initial values for present and absent. Okay, so one of the observations that I make from these mark schemes is it quite often, it might give you an example line of code so you know what you're looking for. But given that the candidate could have answered it in any language, that's only useful to a certain extent. But often you're going to find these statements in the mark scheme that are a little bit ambiguous, set the initial values for present and absent. It kind of suggests that there might be more than one way that you could approach this, and therefore it doesn't matter how you've approached it as long as it achieves the objective. And when I could, for example, decide that I'm going to have an array, and I'm going to use values in an array for whether they're present or absent. I don't know why I would, but I could. So we don't want to be too explicit here. So let's have a look at our program and see if we can find lines that set the initial values for present and absent. Okay, so here we are, look, present equals 0, absent equals 0. They are set as initial values. Would it matter if present was set as, 9999? As Craig said, kind of depends on the mark scheme. If we go back to it, it says set initial values for present and absent. Okay, well, as long as I'm setting some initial values, then I can award the mark. Of course, it is eminently sensible to start them at 0, and it is sensible to name them present and absent, having highlighted the wrong 2 lines. But yeah, you could have called it P and A. It's not ideal, as Craig has suggested, but you probably still get the mark for that, Craig.
Yeah, so this is where obviously I'm out of training from being an examiner now, but me, as in marking this for my own students, if I saw P equals 0, A equals 0, and that was used consistently throughout the code, I would give them a mark for setting. I'd probably turn around to them and say, please don't do that in the exam. You're leaving yourself open to, benefit of doubt style marking now. And, one examiner may give it to you, another one might not. I mean, why are you making it harder for yourself? Name your variables sensibly. But yeah, and that's simple. We've got it there. Give them a mark.
Okay. Right. Okay. Iterate over 20 students in a loop. All right. There's a few things to say about this. Let's go and first identify the line of code and see if we've got it. All right. Iterate over 20 students in a loop. So it's got to be in a loop. We don't want to have, hundreds of statements to achieve this objective. And here's the line of code that does that. So while students is less than or equal to 20. Right, I need to unpack this a little bit. And I think there's 3 things I want to talk about. One is while or for. One is less than equal to operators. And one is whether that should be 20 or 21 or, what that number is on the end of there. Okay. So let's take them one at a time. So they've used a while loop. Now, if they're going to use a while loop and say while students, then later on within this loop, they are going to need to increment that students. Otherwise, they're going to be in an infinite loop and the algorithm isn't going to work. So, Craig, comments on suitability of while and for, etc.
Well, again, just scroll down a little bit to that second mark point. The first thing is, it says iterate over 20 students in a loop. I see while students is less than or equal to 20, all good, less than or equal to. I see the fact they're incrementing students. I've given them the mark and I've moved on. Is it how I want them to do it? Well, that's what we're discussing now. Are there better ways? Well, these are all good discussion points after a mock exam to have with the student, bring with the class. Am I there going, you're not getting the mark because the mark scheme says a 4? No. The example in the mark scheme may use a for loop, but the mark scheme says iterate over 20 students. The student's gone while students is less than or equal to 20. And I can see they've incremented students, mark done, moved on. We award them for getting it right. Is it the way I'd like them to do it? Possibly not. So that's really what we're discussing there. So I would give them the mark for that.
Yeah, the issue of, should it be a for loop, should it be a while loop is a discussion that I have in my class quite a lot, because the purist in me says that you should use a for loop because you know the number of iterations you're going to make. It's stated in the question 20 students, okay? So you know how many iterations that you're going to make here. Therefore, it feels appropriate to be using a for loop. Does it matter for awarding the mark? No, it doesn't.
I think that's what I was getting at. Yes, obviously we're going to have taught them count controlled loop, condition controlled loop, spot the difference. Use for loops for count control, use while loop for condition. They've used the wrong one. Right, I'm not giving you a mark. No. We give them the mark because they've done it right and they've shown it and it works. We educate them that maybe they've not done it the most efficiently, and and we explain why there's a better way of doing it. If we use the for loop, we don't have to do this students plus 1 thing, and but according to the mark scheme, that's valid. It would work. So I think this is where some debates often come up as well. I'm sure you're going to mention that greater than or equal symbol as well.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Except, of course, in some languages, you do have to do the increment even in a for loop. Like C++, those C#, those sorts of languages. But anyway, yeah, absolutely. And actually, when the code is compiled down into machine code, ultimately there's no difference between a for loop and a while loop. It's an iteration as far as the decode unit is concerned. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference once it's been compiled. Anyway, we digress. This bugs me, Craig. I'm going to be honest here. Okay, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. This idea of less than or equal to. Now, students do that because that's what they're taught in maths. But of course, you can't type that on your keyboard, and they shouldn't be doing it in computer science. And I really don't like it. When I see this in exams, I circle it, and I often write slightly sarcastically, "This is computer science, not maths," or or something like that. And I appreciate it's confusing for students to go from one subject to the next there. Of course, what they should be doing here is they should be saying that. Okay, so we know that. I don't like it, and depending on what mood I'm in, it depends on whether I give them a mark for it or not, and that's not really good enough. What do you do in that situation, Craig?
Well, this is where it's tricky, isn't it? Because we are not examiners. So what do they actually do? You know, this is our advice and our opinion. I want to reward students for getting it right. If they have a statement which says while students are less than or equal to 20 and they've used the maths version, I'm going to give them the mark. However, we do need to be careful here, because are they asking the students to write some pseudocode, or are they asking them to write it in a language of their choice? If it's a language of their choice, then this may be one where we're saying, well, that's not relevant. If I take AQA as an example, AQA pseudocode actually uses the symbol you just had. So, you know, AQA, they have a pseudocode guide which they present questions in, just like OCR have the reference language. And AQA pseudocode will show you greater than and less than symbols like that. But of course, AQA also have questions that say, please write this in a language of your choice, in which case then that wouldn't be valid. So I guess this is more difficult for me to give a definitive answer. If I was marking this in this classroom, I would give them the mark. The student has understood it, and I would give them the mark. They've got a for loop. They've got an iterative loop there, which iterates up to 20 students. Would I like them to use a for loop? Yes. Would I like them to use less than and equals a separate? Yes. Will I circle it and bring them up? Yes. You know, I'll train them not to do it. I would give them the mark. If this was a pseudocode answered question, you know, write the pseudocode and did that, I wouldn't even be having this conversation. It's absolutely fine. Your meaning is clear. If it's one of those questions in the exam that says write this in a high level language of your choice, then if that's not a valid symbol in the high level language of choice, this is where we're now starting into territory where I think the examiners may mark that as a 0 now, mark that down. If I'm marking the class, I'm going to mark it right and educate the student.
Yeah, I say to my students, you don't need to take the risk with that one. You know,
absolutely.
You know, all the way through your programming experience with me, we've never once typed that symbol on the keyboard. So don't do it for the first time in an exam. You don't need to. And I find the more I sort of drum it in through lessons, and the more sort of past questions we do, the more they kind of, you know, become familiar with that. So, you know, another bit of advice here is don't leave these algorithm questions to the last part of your revision. Do them throughout the course. You know, I can't believe that teachers don't expose students to these sorts of questions throughout the course. It's good.
I mean, just to clarify then, I mean, if this was OCR, if you were asked to write in pseudocode and you put that, no issues. If you're asked to write in the OCR reference language or a language of your choice, you may get the mark because the examiner may turn around and mark this as BOD, benefit of doubt. It's clearly understood it. We do allow minor syntactical mistakes. I'm giving the benefit of the doubt. Will I tell you that every examiner will mark it like that? Of course I can't. So why take the risk? Train them to do it in the way we want. So, you know, this is an ambiguous one. I would have given them the mark and trained them. Yeah.
And for me, it depends what day of the week it is.
Yeah, I know.
Right. Okay. I just want to talk about this this constant we've got on the end here as well, Craig. So less than or equal to 20. Now, our students started at 0. Okay. So we're going to go from 0 to 20. So we're going to do 21 iterations here. And obviously we're using an array for the student name, and the student here is hard. It can be a little bit hard to follow, but down there it gets incremented. So basically, whatever the value of students is, we're going to have the same value for student. All right. So it is a bit inefficient. We don't need the two variables there, but it doesn't matter. So this is going to crash because it will go out of the bounds of the array. And I'm not inputting 20 students. I'm doing 21. Is that just a little oversight? What I want to say here is let's not worry about that. But you may have a language that's not zero indexed in the array, for example. What do you make of all that?
Oh, you've pulled another tricky one, because we didn't discuss this beforehand, so we could have a natural unscripted video, which is perfect. And I must be honest, I hadn't spotted that until you talked about it. Yes, so of course, my first thought when you first showed it, just scroll back down to the mark scheme. Iterate over 20 students in a loop. Right, that's what we're awarding a mark for. Scroll back up. So we're iterating through 20, possibly 1 students if we have a zero index language. Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I think I'm still going to give the student the mark here and then educate them again appropriately. But now I'm doubting myself.
The comments are going to go wild.
Oh, no.
You know, we're talking about it because this is what students do. And this is the dilemma that teachers find themselves in. And, you know, we're not saying that we have absolutely the right answer here, as Craig said right at the very beginning. What we're doing is having a discussion with each other about the legitimacy of awarding the mark. And I do think this is an interesting one, isn't it? I think I'm with you, Craig. I think I would see that as a minor oversight. Yeah. And to be honest, would I even notice when I'm marking, quite a lot of these papers? Am I even going to notice? I think what I'm looking for really is, have they got an iterative statement, a while or a for? Yeah. Does it look like it iterates over, roughly the right number of students? Are they using a variable that is clearly going to increment the way that you would expect it to for this to work? What did they assign? Here it is, actually. What did they assign it to begin with to make that work? So I think a combination of that statement there, that statement there, and that statement there, I think they've got enough for me to award what is effectively.
Well, you're right. I've fallen into my own trap here, because has the student shown me an understanding of what's required here? And they have they made a minor syntactical error? Well, possibly, if the language they choose is zero-based indexing, blah blah. But that would come up if they were really programming it. They would find that, they would fix that. They'd get a syntax error, runtime, or just a logical error, and they go, oh, hang on, what have I done here? But no, you're right. We've got enough. They've got enough pressure as it is in the exam without making sure the actual, letters they're writing on the page are 100% syntactically correct and free of bugs. And the exam board don't expect that, as we keep saying. They make it really clear. So I'm going to step back again and say, actually, I would give that the mark. And if I had spotted that, I would then educate the student again. Sure. But no, I'd have given that a mark and moved on by now.
Yeah, I know. I'm just deliberately dragging it out for you. Right, let's...
Because I've got 20 papers to mark and I'm not going to spend longer than I need to. It's like, they've done it. They've shown it. They've proved it. Give them the mark.
Yeah, okay. This is a quick one then, I reckon. Output the student name. So again, if I go back up to our code, output the student name, that is never going to work because I'm a parenthesis short. I don't care, right?
Yeah, I would give them the mark for that. Again, they've missed a bracket on the end. They've got a print statement. They've got student name. They're using the array there. They've opened up the brackets. They've put the variable with the correct name in. Bless them. They forgot to draw a close circle bracket, normal bracket. I'm giving them the mark. And again, if I spot it, I will educate them.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, input present or sorry, my highlighting is awful. You can tell my mouse skills today, they're not on par. Input present or absent. Okay, so here we are. So attend equals input present or absent. I don't think there's any debate there. That's a mark.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Store the registration mark. So for example, student reg, and because I've made this a little bit bigger, it's gone over onto the next line. Okay, right. So we're looking for a statement here that stores that registration. Are you spotting one, Craig, and are you awarding a mark?
Go back down to the mark scheme again.
So the mark scheme says I probably need to make
the
it
registration mark, e.g. student reg, student equals attendant. Okay.
Yeah, store the registration mark. Okay.
Am I being blind here? Am I not seeing that?
You're not seeing that.
Okay.
You're not seeing that. What we're storing is the count.
Yeah.
We're storing a count of the number of present and absent, but we're not storing the actual registration mark of the student. Now, we do temporarily put it into a variable without any validation, which incidentally, the question didn't ask for, don't worry about, okay?
Yeah.
So temporarily we're storing it, but that's not what we mean by storing. It needs to be, you know, put somewhere. And if we read the question, which is another good exam technique, always go back and read the question. All right? It does say the registration mark is stored in an array called student reg. So I'm looking for a reference here to student reg. It's not there.
Yeah. Well, that's an easy one. That's an easy one. They don't get the mark for that.
Yeah. Okay. So correct condition based on the input. So we've input attend, and now we're saying if attend is present, do this. Otherwise, if attend is absent, do this. Clearly a mark.
Yeah, and that's fine. Yeah, absolutely. And I know
does it matter if I use elif? I mean, is the code still going to work, for example, if I do that? Yes, it is. So it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't affect the logic of what's going on in this particular situation.
And if I just written the word else and not done elif, I would give them the mark. We know that wouldn't work in Python. It may not be the version from the pseudocode language, but it is absolutely clear what they're doing. Condition, if check this variable, does it contain this? If it does, do this line. Otherwise, do this line. It's clear. Yeah.
I mean, from a user's point of view, that's an absolute pain. You don't want to be typing the word present for every single student. So you'd want to sort of, do something about that and maybe do that. So, and anything, we're not really marking this part of it as such. What we're marking is this part of it. Are we using the same variable that we input, and are we using a condition statement on it? That's what we're marking. So
the candidate is demonstrating to my satisfaction knowledge of the correct construct to be used there. It's in the mark scheme. They get the mark. Yeah.
So count the number of present and absent students. So we just really kind of talked about those two lines of code. So here's a line of code that's doing that. Present equals present plus 1. Absent equals absent plus 1. So that's going to work. There's no problem with that. However, I want to use this as an opportunity to talk about the student that forgets to write present equals present plus 1 and does a number of things instead. So the first thing that they might do is they might do that. And that is perfectly legitimate C syntax. So there's no issue there at all. And you could have done, plus equals. There's no issue with that at all. Okay, different ways of doing it. But that then begs the question, what if I do that and I forget the equals? Am I now still counting? Because that's what the student did down here. And of course, our whole while loop isn't going to work because of this statement here. So how acceptable is that? How essential is an equals sign here to award a mark?
Yeah. This is another slightly tricky one. Again, if they've been told to answer in pseudocode and they say present plus 1, well, you want to increment the variable, fine, give them the mark. If it's one of those questions that said, please answer in a high-level language of your choice, where we're allowed minor syntactical errors, we're slightly more up to the benefit of the doubt and past experience here. Would that now get the mark? It would be tricky. I mean, the beauty we have as teachers, I don't know if you ever do this, Dave, is I sometimes turn around and go, oh, you know what? I'll give you a half mark for that, but don't do it in the exam. It is clear. Yeah. Well, we do, don't we?
No.
No, I do. I go, look, it's clear what you meant, but you're opening yourself up here to getting no marks in the exam if they ask you to write in syntactically correct code. Oh, but we're allowed minor syntax errors. Yes, but student plus one doesn't do anything. It's not a minor syntax error. It's completely wrong. And then, of course, on a different day of the week, I turn around and go, know what? Actually, it's very clear what you meant. I'm giving you the mark.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I slightly disagree with you in the sense that I think, in C, it's perfectly legitimate to write present plus plus. That increments the present variable by 1, okay? So what we're talking about is a minor syntactical error because I missed a single digit. I've still got plus, I'm still incrementing, I'm still adding. And please comment down below because I can't remember the language here, but I'm convinced there's a language that increments with that syntax. And if there is, and increments with that syntax, and if there is, then that is a perfectly acceptable answer. So I'm giving the mark for this. It sounds like for you, it depends on what day of the week it is. But for the students, spot it as part of your process of doing these past paper questions and say to them, look, you might get a mark, you might not get a mark, depends on the question, depends on the mark scheme, etc. Can you just not take the risk with it? If you're in doubt, then always do double pluses. All right, that would be a good thing. Oh, that reminds me, I've forgotten something else actually. Up here, if attend equals present, when we were talking about the condition a moment ago, you can't do that in Python because, of course, it needs to be double equals. But we know that in a lot of other languages, a single equals is absolutely fine because you can overload the operator and do two things with it. So I forgot to talk about that, but it's relevant, isn't it? Because if we're prepared to accept that there, then surely we should be prepared to accept that there, shouldn't we? All we're doing is missing an equal sign, aren't we?
Yeah, okay, maybe you swayed me.
I don't know. I think you're being a bit harsh if you don't give them the mark, is my view. But but this is why we're having a discussion, because there's not necessarily a right or wrong. And we would invite any examiners watching this, come and join us on an Unscripted series. We'd love to kind of review questions like this again and talk about them with you. That would be fantastic. Okay, right, where are we then? Last one. So output the number of present and absent students. Okay, so down at the bottom here, we've got our present variable, we've got our absent variable. I think probably that variable matching that variable matching that variable is probably quite important for that functionality to work. But I am printing the number present and I am printing the number absent. So it's definitely a mark in this context. I don't think we're arguing that. But, what if the student had accidentally done something silly like this? For example, is it still worth a mark? What if they had done this? So it's still outputting the data and it calculated it correctly, but they just have got the wrong label next to the variable. I mean, it sounds silly, but when you're in an exam situation, you make silly mistakes. What do you reckon?
Well, I've even got, that's an interesting one. But the one I was thinking about more, if you just move your mouse to the left of the word present in that first print statement.
There.
Right, and delete everything before that other than the open bracket.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Right, and do the same for the next line.
Yep.
Do you give them a mark for that? So I was thinking, well, the answer is I would.
Yep.
It says output the number of present and absent students. Print variable present, print variable absent. Is it useful to the user? No, they get a couple of numbers on the screen and no context as to what they mean. Will we educate them? Yes. Is it correct and worth a mark? Yes. You might want to undo that and just go back to what you did, because now, bizarrely, I was giving a mark for that without question. Yeah. But if I've now got a label that says present but it prints absence, by providing more code, I've added more confusion. Would I give them a mark there? They've done it. They've outputted the number of absent students and prefixed it with the word present. Oh. I hate this unscripted series sometimes. I wish I knew what was coming. It's certainly an education point, isn't it? Say, look, you don't want to make that mistake in the exam. I mean, are you outputting absent? You are. Does that mean you get the mark? Yes. Are you going to cause an examiner to pause a second? Yeah, you are. I mean, you may get a benefit of the doubt mark from one and you may not get it from another. I can't tell you the answer. I'm not that examiner who's marking your paper. It's tricky, isn't it? They have achieved what's in the mark scheme. Going by my opening statement, you should give them the mark. Would every examiner? Maybe not. That's the reality, Dave, I'm afraid.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about marking accuracy in a moment. Remind me if I forget. But
okay.
Yeah, so let's have a quick review then. So out of all the points in the mark scheme, the only one where we're really adamant that we're not giving a mark for is store the registration mark. Okay, so we made 7 points out of a possible 8-mark question. We're marking that 7 out of 8. And just as a final reflection on that, Craig, would you then be tempted to go for 6 out of 8 because it is riddled with sort of errors sort of all over the place? I mean, or is it,
again,
it doesn't, that those little minor errors are not cumulative. And at the end of the day, it's still 7 out of 8 points made. I think for me, it's not cumulative making those errors. There's nothing in there that's glaringly wrong.
But the point is, if you read the question, you look at the mark scheme, and then you just look at that answer. When you look at that answer, this is a student who understands how to program. They've initialized variables, they've used iteration, they've used indentation, they've used print statements and assignment and selection. They've incremented variables. As we said, would that run? No. Are there lots of syntax errors? Yes. But we're trying to assess a student's knowledge and have they put it across correctly? Well, they have. As I said, on one given day, I may have given that 6 or 6.5. On another, I may have given it 7. But what we sometimes see on the forums is people going, well, I wouldn't give that any marks. Well, I would never be giving this less than 6, even on my mean days, Dave. No, I would certainly be educating the students in all the ways we have said. Would I be consistent? No, because I'm a human being. And I think we're probably going to talk about that in just a second, although we're up to 47 minutes. It's a long one today. But yeah, I'm giving this 6 as a minimum. And on most days, I'm probably giving it 7. The student understands what they're doing. They're showing me their knowledge. Award them the marks.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, I completely agree. And of course, there is a tolerance range in the sense that you're not going to get marking 100% accurate. So let's just talk about that for a second, because you're allowed to be a certain number of marks kind of out, and still it's not going to affect the grade. I'm sort of saying tentatively, but you're allowed a certain amount of tolerance there before they start questioning whether the overall mark is valid. But I think 25% of marking is wrong anyway, and dare I say it, that there's only 75% of it that's accurate anyway, and it's quite often, I don't know, is it questions like this where this is happening? I'm not sure, but yeah, it's surprising. Everyone thinks that it's an exact science, and it should be, but it isn't. But there are human factors at play here. So my advice to a candidate is do everything you can to try and remove the ambiguity. Do what you've been taught in class. Don't suddenly make something up that you haven't been taught in exams. However, with a big caveat that if you are really struggling, don't leave anything blank. Attempt it. And if you can't remember in the heat of the moment, how do I do an iteration? I can't remember the name of the command. Then just invent one. You may not get the mark for it, but you may, because your logic is sound. And so always attempt, always make syntax up if you have to. But my advice is don't do it deliberately, because the exam is not the place to be clever.
I think actually I've mentioned it a few times, but I'm just going to close with one final thing, Dave. I've said quite a few, this BOD, benefit of doubt, and that just goes to highlight the point I made at the start, that the exam board want to award you for the knowledge that you can show. They want to award you for getting it right. They don't want to penalize you for every mistake, because the exam board specifically, when they are marking your paper, these examiners, you know, they tick, got a mark, cross, got it wrong, but they are able to write BOD, a little acronym, which means, well, you know what? I'm going to give them the mark because I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. Is it ideal? No. Is it what I teach my students? No. But is it clear from the understanding here that they know what they're getting at? I think it is. So even in the marking protocols that examiners have, they are able to award you a full mark by using benefit of the doubt. And that just goes to show that the whole mechanism of marking is designed to try and award you with the most marks possible for what you know and not to penalize you. So we should therefore mark students in a positive way. And I think that's probably a nice little point to end on. Any closing comments from you, Dave?
No, I think you summed it up perfectly, and no doubt the forums will be alive with comments and examples. And comment down below. Feel free to agree with us, disagree with us, and if you are an examiner out there and you've got experience, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. So
yeah, exactly. Everything you said is being absolute bonkers, guys. I need to correct it. Well, come on a video and we'll do that. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you again next week. Cheers. Bye-bye.